All right. Well, thanks for joining for our planned iteration retrospective. Uh, Working through, we're participating in this, iteration onboarding training. Um, they're trying to curate and make advancements on, so we're beta group. So yeah, we're going to go through a couple of these, talk about the issues that we need, the training issues we need to get closed, and etc. So I guess we'll just hop in. Thanks for joining. So progress on iteration training issues. Again, there's just videos and documentation to review. It's not a ton. Those are due April 3rd, so just keep that in mind. Gabe, yep, since you're not a manager, you're technically done. Great, cool. Thanks for keeping on that. Just make sure you check the boxes and close the issues when you're done so they don't have to chase us down and ask for status updates. So for those who were able to join Sid's iteration office hours on March 25th, thoughts, concerns, specifically if we want to talk about the individual items that got reviewed. Donald, you want to open that up with your real-time comments?
Yes. One point is I couldn't even, so I was at the office hours, but I was having trouble finding where the recording of it is. So if someone has access to that, could link it into this, to our agenda here, that'd be great.
I think the shadows might add it to I'll follow up. I'll find
YouTube playlist.
I think at least I had to when I was a shadow. So maybe Alexis is testing one.
Let's see. It's not in that playlist. The last one is a couple weeks back.
Yeah, okay. It might just not have been uploaded. I'll follow up and get that. I'll share that out with the group.
Okay. Awesome. But yeah, one thing I found of particular interest, just because it's definitely relative to what we're doing, is around real time. And it just got me thinking, was there anything that we could have done as a group to make that more iterative? Because real time just in general has been an issue. The actual issue has been formed for a while now. So now that we're getting closer to the finish line of that first iteration, which is great, I'm just wondering what else we could have done to, could we to run anything in parallel? Could we have done some of the infrastructure stuff a little earlier on? Could we have taken it from another? I know this was also an issue or a topic that was kind of cross-functional, not cross-functional, but cross-team. So could we have owned it a little earlier?
Yeah, I have a lot to say about that. Largely because I participated in one of kind of the retro issues that Christopher opened up for the team to discuss, and I think there was I sense that since it was being assigned to milestones by the memory team, that the memory team is going to work on it. So I was under the assumption that we just had to wait for them to do that part of it. When it became clear that they weren't going to actually prioritize it, we should have done a cleaner handoff there. And I think in watching the iteration video that Sid and Christopher did together, I think it's around 1920 in the timeline. Sid basically says waiting for approval slows down cycle time. It's incompatible with iteration, and you don't want a dependency on another team. It's super bad. So I think it's one of those examples where I've seen that across the board, and specifically this, where we almost allowed ourselves to feel some sort of dependency on another team, and we should have just done it ourselves. So yes, I agree. We should have just done it from the start.
Okay. So no, I think that's good. I mean, I think it's helpful to pull out any improvements or thoughts, not just specifically iterating on work. So I think that's good feedback. I think handoffs are even harder in async environment, and you have to be much more intentional with them. So I think that's a good point we can focus on and try to be better. Any thoughts about the actual breakdown discussion, iterative discussion from the office hours on this, or what should be done next, or anything like that?
I think it's on a good trajectory. Chris followed up with me, or Christopher followed up with me in Slack, and I had basically said that most of the credit for that goes to the engineering team and just like pushing back to do the smallest thing. And so like, I don't know if you can get much smaller than having one field updating in real time. Like it seems like to me, and not even updating in real time, literally the real time portion of it is just sending a Boolean to the front end saying, hey, this is updated. So go get the right data. And then making like a HTTP fetch to get the new data. Like that's, I don't know. I don't think you can get smaller. So maybe
so
other folks have
that,
opinions, but
I agree. And I think Sid even called that out as a great first iteration is just focusing on one component, just focusing on assignees and getting that out. And I think it's interesting just looking back at that, like to your point around instead of sending all the data, just a Boolean saying that this changed or not, was another thing that we like. That iteration came after actually looking through and determining that, you know, get everything out would be a larger ask. So let's break this down even further to a smaller iteration. So I think that was good. I think there was a lot of value in that, and I don't know if that was specific. Oh yeah, you did call it out in the office hours too, which is good.
Any other thoughts on that before we move on into more like a plan specific conversation?
I liked how, sorry, real quick beforehand. I like in the office hours how we, like it's not just the iterating on technical solutions, but also like iterating on how we, like I think Ray brought up something about discussing or how we reward community members, but talking through that too and talking through some marketing iteration. It's always interesting to see how other functions also iterate.
What was the most interesting thing you learned there, Donald?
It was probably the one with Ray about the community and yeah, incentivizing contributors. I found that one to be interesting. I don't know why. I should probably give you some reasons on why, but I just remember when listening to it in real time that I was like, oh, this is interesting, and it's definitely fun to see or cool to see how other functions continue to iterate.
Cool. All right. Let's hop into the next iteration retrospective discussion. So let's talk about a past example of a successful iteration. Like, why was this successful? How did it meet the definition of MVC? Mark looks like you put the first thought in there. You want to take it away?
Yeah, no, I think we did a really great job with the requirements management, really breaking it down. The engineering team really dove in and found and broke it down into multiple, much smaller issues, which I think was great. And we were able to complete a bunch of those in 12.9, and we're going to finish up at 12.10. I just want to point out we did find one issue with this, though, and that's the upcoming releases page, which is that auto-generated thing that grabs all the basically issues with certain labels and puts them on for like the product timeline. The issue with that was the requirements management MVC issue and the one that said, create a new requirement, both completed in 12.9. So there's nothing in 12.10. So it looks like if you look at that upcoming releases page, it looks like there's nothing going on in 12.10 because I didn't want to put a direction element on some of these smaller sort of infrastructure type issues like, enable the feature flag and those types of things aren't really direction items. So there is a bit of a disconnect here. And I heard back from sales a little bit and they said, that makes it hard for us because when we go out in the field and say, hey, this is all the stuff that's coming out, they don't see requirements on there. And so they don't know how they can track that. Ideally, that page should probably be built from epics, not issues, but that's a whole other discussion. So just sort of a word of warning as we break things down, when we close out issues, which is what we should be doing, you do sometimes lose the ones off that page, off that upcoming releases page, which makes it a little bit more difficult to sort of show your roadmap in that specific example. And I got some feedback on that, so I just want to share.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting one too. I think I've seen where we've had an issue and it's been split into multiples, and then customers and internal folks start thumbs upping it, and it's hard to like aggregate the support for something when it's scattered over multiple issues, which I think is an opportunity for us to maybe do some roll-ups at the epic level. But I think that's a different.
Yeah, I mean, that page shows anything with the direction label applied in the 12.10 release. The thing is I don't know if we should be adding a direction label to things like, update the GraphQL API. Like, that's not really a direction type. It doesn't feel like a direction item. It is, because it's completing requirements management. I guess in theory, you put direction label on everything under the requirements management MVC, but then it clutters things up. So it's kind of a no-win. And if I look back over what's left in the epic, none of them in the titles, and again, we can change titles, but none of them in the titles directly say finish requirements management. And I don't want to update the titles of these because they're very descriptive of what they're doing right now. So we're kind of caught in this odd limbo state where there's nothing that shows it's getting done, but it is. And that's not anybody's fault on this team. It's just external optics. It's not the best. So we need to figure out a path forward on those.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of the other side of the coin. Like, as we get better at breaking things down smaller and smaller, how do we then get better at communicating how it all aggregates together? Yeah, I think that's good feedback.
I would love to rise those up to epics and just show epics on that page, but that's probably not in the cards in the short term.
Well, why not? If that's what we need to do, let's open up the code.
Yeah.
All right. John, you want to talk about Jira Importer?
What would you like to know? Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was a good example, mostly because I saw members of the team take on some of the work, which doesn't seem to happen very often. So that shows that the work was broken down well. We also did kind of a remote XP thing in that we built the prototype, and then once we'd answered our questions, we threw it out. And we started coding it from scratch with good quality built in. So yeah, there was a few things there. We also benefited from, we didn't necessarily keep reviews inside the team, but we definitely took advantage of the fact that we have reviewers and maintainers on the team to speed up the process and get the reviews through quicker. So yeah, there's a lot of good things about that. We're also like, it had a number of people watching it, EMs and PMs, to ensure that scope was kind of ruthlessly cut at all times. Anytime anything started to creep in, there was a bit of a moment where somebody sort of went, hey, hang on, do we really need that? And because we always have a backlog, we have a second iteration full of stuff that we could be building if we had the time and if we had spare capacity. So we had it broken down nicely that way as well, where we could always say, well, it'd be nice to have that, but don't build it. We'll build this instead if we have extra capacity. So yeah, for all those reasons, I nominate the Jira Importer.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And actually, I think, Justin, you've got a nice segue out of that conversation on, like, for the benefit of the recording and people who will watch this later, let's talk about one of the ruthlessly cut scope items that allowed us to maintain a small MVC.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that was, and John said it well, but the description parser was a great example where I don't know if we didn't know that it would be here. I think we actually called out that it was going to be a risky part of the implementation. But once we got into it, like, engineers, engineering managers, and PMs all sort of swarmed on a single problem, and then continued to iterate and cut ruthlessly, in the words of John Hope, as it came up. And I thought that was a really good example of, like, we just didn't take for granted once the work started and kind of let it just go through the cycle. We took each and every piece and made sure that it was scoped well and iterated as best as we could. Ruthlessly.
Yeah. That's good. Well, I think also, we had to make some uncomfortable early cuts when we started talking about user mapping too. Just understanding that could be much more complex and not something we could fit into a single cycle. Yeah, that was another one. Gabe, you have a great question on there if you want to verbalize that.
Yeah, so I think the Jira Importer is like the epitome of collaboration, I think, and what I would expect at all the development, product design, UX interactions to look like at GitLab. But like, how can we recreate that without it being almost like forced because we have to write daily updates to our leadership and it's a CEO interest item and those sorts of things? Like, how can we make that the norm? Because I actually enjoy working in a more collaborative way like that, and it's more hands-on with engineers and designers as we are going and iterating and cutting things and making decisions on the fly, because it's a lot less wasteful up front when you do it that way. But just how can we recreate that on an ongoing basis?
Well, I mean, do we maybe for sets of features or something that's going to drive value and knowing it's going to come and split into multiple issues, like do we maybe focus on like kickoffs, like having a session to say, hey, here's the idea, here's the thought, here's the proposed proposal. What do we do to break this down, answer questions about why it's important, why it's critical in a certain timeline?
Yeah, like one example would be that I could see where it's the inverse is the, I guess, burn up charts on milestones. Like we had some conversation in the planning breakdown phase of how we would approach it, but it wasn't the same people that ended up working on it. And I wasn't sure who that was going to be, so they weren't involved in the decision-making process. And so it's almost like, what if when we identify these things that are going to get split out into epics, and during the planning breakdown phase, we figure out who's going to be working on it, and that way they can be involved in the decisions and the collaboration from the onset. It's almost like this is the thing that you're going to work on until it's done kind of approach. I thought that was really, really helpful with the Jira importer, because like I knew that Alexandria was going to be there, and like we could have those conversations and we're not losing knowledge, I guess. So that could be one way that we approach it.
Another thing I was thinking of or observing was how well we swarmed on it and had multiple engineers working on one thing. And then we knew as PM, like UX counterparts, that was the most important thing. Unfortunately, we knew it because we had to update a thing every day and it had CEO interest. But like, is there a way we can replicate this where we continue to swarm on issues and then have that like less surface area for the stable counterparts to care about, so that you can stay focused on the most important things, and help those move along? Like, I don't know if we would have had that ruthless iteration and scope cutting if it was one of 15 things in flight, right? It would have just sort of been a comment and maybe a couple people commented and moved on, and then the engineer would continue to spin their wheels on it. So I don't know if there's a version of that we could try.
I feel like that's true from a designer perspective as well. And I'd like to maybe propose rephrasing the question to what might interfere with us recreating this scenario. Because for me, asynchronous communication takes a little longer. And because I'm getting hit with asynchronous communication from all over the place, it takes more time for me to go through all of those things. But when the Jira importer came in, it was such a high priority that I just intentionally pushed everything out of the way, just focused on that. And then had a lot of synchronous conversations with the developers and Gabe, which helped to speed things along, I think, a little bit. But I know that that's not necessarily the way we want to always operate. So I'm curious what everyone thinks interferes with doing this approach more often.
I think we want to work on this, a couple different versions of it, but having epics on issue boards, or at least like epic swim lanes, would help, at least me, because then you can see all of your, like, to Justin's point, all of the high level things that are in flight at one point in time, like, and I think that's where it kind of also goes hand in hand with work in progress limits too, of saying like, we're only going to work on a few things at a time, but being able to see those things like tied back up to the bigger things that we're working on. So everybody's looking at the same, like, that's the whole point of Kanban, is like everybody looks at the same work in progress, and like looks at the flow of value basically through the system in the same way. So that could be a cool thing to do too, build that feature, I guess. But I agree with you, Holly. It is like when I sit down, I have 50 to-dos from a bunch of people, and they're not like high priority things, but I feel like bad not responding. But then you get like lost in this weird ether of managing communications, basically.
And you don't know what's high priority until you read through all of them, and then half a day is gone. Just trying to understand what needs attention and what doesn't.
And so I think what Justin and Holly both said, just making sure, like if we do this for every project, then like everything becomes priority, which means nothing is priority. So I think the hardest thing would be identifying what we would want to swarm on. That would be something good to identify.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what we're trying to do with these like kickoff issues we do every month, right? It's like we're pretty explicitly stating like priority direction items. I mean, I think by definition, if it's got a direction label on it, it's top of stack. Yeah. But I think how do you then, like you said, like deal with all of them?
I think stakes are important as well. Like something's the Jira importer's high stakes. It's high stakes because like we're all focused on it. We all spend we all index a lot more time towards it. And Sid's watching it and everybody else is watching it, right? It's high stakes, and it's cool to have something high stakes that motivates people. The people working on the Jira importer really enjoy it, at least as far as I can see. And if I believe what I'm told, they really enjoy it for that reason. And honestly, I don't think it would be a terrible thing if in each milestone we had something of that caliber where we got to succeed or fail as a team around one big sort of title item. Even if you're not working directly on it, you're working on other stuff that's shielding the people who are working on it, and we can sort of own the success as a team.
I like that. Yeah, I think as we get better from the product side of being able to like aggregate data on usage and growth and be able to tie, like, for example, these roadmap improvements, like we have top ultimate customers repeatedly asking for it. So I think that's something, if we can communicate the demand for it as well as in the results, that helps tell that story and help motivation. Yeah. Cool. In the interest of time.
Yeah, so sorry.
Go ahead. No, just say
real quick.
We have another section and I'll schedule a different call for that. Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, perfect. So I was just gonna say it'd be nice because it sounds like if we all as a team have one thing to focus on, like we can all swarm on that thing. We can all group together to get that one, the engineers UX product can all swarm together to get that one thing done. So what if we try to create, like when a release comes up, define a theme for that release. And it can even just be one like epic that we want to accomplish within that release. We have the kickoff issue that defines what this is going to look like, what this is going to require. We create a Slack channel, a featured Slack channel, which I think has also helped with the Jira importer, just having the Slack channel of everyone that's involved in actually building it as kind of a smaller team. And it can even include everyone within that group. So if it's a portfolio management issue or epic or theme, we include everyone within the portfolio management engineering team, UX team in that feature channel. And then, like John said, even if people aren't directly working on that specific feature, they know what's going on. They know that the work they're doing outside of that feature is work to shield the people that are actually working on that feature from taking on other work. Like I'm just trying to think of action items of anything we can kind of take from the things we did well in the Jira importer.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think, and this is, I think I'm going to be the quintessential product manager here. I think I want to balance that with like, how do we find a scenario where we can actually deliver more than one feature every 30 days? I think you can priority rank it and stack it, but I don't want to get in the scenario where it's like we have one priority item that's the only thing we're trying to get through. Like if we are breaking things down better, we should be able to move MVCs through faster, if that makes sense.
It does. But I feel like when we get so spread out, which where we're kind of at now, like on so many different things, that's where we get into the one engineer owns one task, one engineer owns another. Everyone's kind of siloed in their one specific thing. I'm wondering so if we have themes, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're only going to deliver one feature milestone. It just essentially says that the features that we are going to deliver are all related, and they're all toward the goal of all of them is toward improving on one specific spot of the product, one specific area of the product.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think
And a
that's
suggestion
good.
for iterating towards that, Keenan, like the importer was an example of swarming and focusing on one thing across all of plan. Maybe in the future we try one per group, like one for project management, one for portfolio, and one for certify. Because at the end of the day, requirements management is actually shipping in 12.10 as well. We just haven't been talking about that and focusing on it. And granted, most of it was done in 12.9. But maybe that's a way to iterate it. So if we get good at swarming on one thing for a few releases consecutively, then we try and add, one per group or something like that.
Okay. Yeah,
That's a way to iterate.
Again, interest of time, I don't want to keep us longer than we've scheduled. I'll set up another call to talk through past examples that we could have done better, and we can have that conversation there. Cool. Well, thanks for joining, everybody. Appreciate it. We'll talk soon.
Ciao.
Thanks for